Hi guys, we are approaching my favorite time of year, and I'm not talking about the holidays. Nope, I'm talking about macromolecules. It's time to talk about proteins and carbs and fats, and the reason I love this so much is because we're talking about food. So here's how you're probably used to thinking about these words. We've got proteins, carbs, and fats, right? So you might have thought of this as the foods you eat in different categories of foods, where let's think about a sandwich. Our proteins could be the meat we have in our sandwich, the cheese maybe. The carbohydrates would be like the bread for sure, probably lettuce, tomato, other vegetables, plant type things. And even the seasonings, guys, like basil and oregano, they came from plants. So that could be too. You've got fats like mayonnaise, avocado, if that's on your sandwich, or olive oil. There's some other things that don't quite fall into those categories, like salt and pepper, which are really just chemicals. But guys, you know a lot about macromolecules. And like, obviously, this red panda is like loving macromolecules. So it's probably worth learning about. Oh my gosh, just look at him. Okay, now we're going to move on. So you're going to need some vocabulary to get this started. So let me just give you a couple words here. The first one is the word monomer. So monomers are building blocks of biomolecules or macromolecules, and they build bigger things called polymers. You might know that mono means one and poly means many, so polymers are made out of a lot of monomers. And the big idea is that carbs, fats, and proteins, they're all made of these little units that repeat, they join together, and they form bigger structures with specific functions. Now, I kind of like to think about this in terms of Legos. A pile of Legos is cool. I've got a bunch of little things, but what I really want is this cool thing that I can build out of it that has this unique structure and function, like my dinosaur. So let's talk about some carbohydrates. What are the structures of these? Well, some of them are really simple. We can have single carbohydrate units called monosaccharides. There's that mono again, just one saccharide, which is the unit for carbohydrates. Or I can have disaccharides, where see I join two of these together. So I could take a glucose, a monosaccharide, and join it to a fructose, a monosaccharide, and I get a sucrose molecule. And I can do the same thing by joining a glucose and a galactose, and I can get this lactose disaccharide. And then polysaccharides are what happen when I join a ton of these monosaccharides together. And those are pushing towards what we're going to call complex carbohydrates. So instead of being simple and just having a couple of units, these are these massive molecules where we've joined a ton of saccharides together, and we get things called starch. Probably heard of that before. Glycogen, maybe you've heard about that before in terms of like athletics and people storing up carbohydrates for a long race. You might have also heard of cellulose, and this might not be a storage molecule, but when we add a bunch of carbohydrates together in plants, they provide a strength or the structure needed to keep a plant in its shape. So those are some complex carbohydrates. And guys, again, I love food. So let's talk about this in terms of things we already know. Monosaccharides, we've got fructose, or this sugar found in a lot of the fruits you like to eat. We've got glucose, which is that sugar that we learned about plants making in photosynthesis. For disaccharides, we've got lactose, which is the disaccharide or the sugar found in all dairy products, like cheeses, milks, yogurts. And we also have sucrose, which is table sugar. So I've got my sugar cubes here. In terms of the more complex carbohydrates, those polysaccharides, I've got all kinds of starches like pastas. Cellulose, or the fiber you might find in vegetable products or plant products. So those would be my complex carbohydrates. Now, the next category we're going to talk about is called lipids. But for our purposes, lipids are fats. And we need to talk about the structure. So let's look at that here. Lipids are a little different. Not all of their units look exactly the same. They've got this part here on the left called a glycerol molecule. And then they have 3 chains of what's called a fatty acid. That's the general structure, and you don't need to worry too much about that. But the idea is that these things can join together through a process called dehydration synthesis and form a unit, just like we saw our monosaccharides and carbohydrates joining together to form polysaccharides. So it's the same idea that we have little units that join together. Now, this is what it looks like as a final product. We have a glycerol connected to 3 fatty acid chains. And that together is called a triglyceride. Tri meaning 3, referring to those 3 fatty acid chains. Now there's different kinds of fats, and you might already know this from looking at nutrition labels. So maybe you've heard before of unsaturated fats and saturated fats, and even maybe trans fats. And you might have just heard this in the context of what's healthy and what's not, but we're going to talk about the chemical difference and what that means for how these things interact with each other. So if you look here, a saturated fatty acid chain, well, hold on, what does saturated mean? Have you heard that word before? Saturated just means that it is something is completely full. So my tissue could be saturated with water. It would be dripping wet. It can't hold any more water. Now, if you look at this molecule, each carbon is bound to as many other atoms as it can be. It's got the maximum number of bonds to hydrogen atoms. On the contrast, the unsaturated fatty acid has a couple carbons here that have a double bond. Now, what that means is, look, they're bonded to 1 less hydrogen than they otherwise would be. And chemically, this ends up causing what we call a kink in the chain, meaning that this molecule is bent compared to that saturated fatty acid. Now, who cares? Well, it turns out that when these things pack together, since saturated fatty acids are straight, they can pack more tightly. And that ends up determining whether the substance can pack tightly and be a solid, or is more fluid and it's actually a liquid. So that's the difference, is are these molecules straight or are they bent? And we can figure this out looking at a nutrition label. So one of these nutrition labels, label A or label B, corresponds to butter and one to olive oil. Which is which, and how do you know? So now that you've had a chance to think about that, this nutrition label says that only 2 grams of the total fat are saturated fat. So very little saturated fat. On contrast, this one says that 7 grams of the total fat are saturated fat. So over half. Now, if we remember, saturated fat molecules are straight. So in this case, since those molecules are straight and packed close together, this substance will be solid at room temperature. Now, is butter or olive oil solid at room temperature? Butter is. So label B is the label for butter. Whereas this molecule or this substance has a ton of unsaturated fat, meaning that its fatty acid chains are kinked or bent, and so they don't pack together tightly. and we have a liquid at room temperature. I think that's kind of cool. Have you ever dropped olive oil or oil of any kind in a glass of water? What happened? Why do those droplets separate? Well, let's look here. This is what a phospholipid looks like. It's called a phospholipid because it has a phosphate group here in the dark blue. But what we see here are fatty acid chains. Some of them are saturated or straight. Some of them are unsaturated or bent. And what that ends up meaning is that these fatty acid chains can pack kind of close together, but because of the unsaturated fatty acid chains, they don't pack quite close together enough to have the membrane be solid. So these bent chains keep it flexible, but the straight chains mean it's still one unit. It packs kind of closely together. Now, interestingly, there's this word called hydrophilic. Philic means loving, and hydro means water. So this section of the molecule loves water, or chemically is attracted to water. But these tails, the hydrophobic or water-fearing tails, don't like water. So when we put a lot of these molecules together, they form a membrane where all of the tails that fear water face inside and are protected from the water on either side of the membrane. The water-loving parts face out and interact with water while these tails are protected inside. So that's how our membranes are made up, our cell membranes, and we'll talk more about that when we start talking about cells next trimester. Now we've got one more group of molecules to look at, and those are proteins, which are arguably the most interesting. Now proteins have 4 levels of structure that get more and more complex. The first level is just amino acids joining together. This is like what we've seen before. The monomer, or the single small unit, is an amino acid, but they join together to form what's called a polypeptide chain. Now, those chains can interact with each other in various ways to make either helices, or what I like to think of as slinkies, spirals, or sheets that are pleated. They're kind of zigzag. Those are those beta pleated sheets. Now those can interact with each other to form a really complex 3D structure. And we can get even more complex if multiple complex structures join together. And what this ends up meaning is that proteins can have all kinds of crazy functions. They can be antibodies involved in your immune system. They can transport important molecules. They can be involved in muscle contraction. They can be involved in making reactions go faster. That's what enzymes do. They can be hormones. They can pump things across membranes that were made of lipids. Or they can be receptors. You have receptors on your tongue that make you taste your food. So proteins can do all kinds of things. So the example I'm going to zoom in on for you here is blood cells. Now here's a picture of your red blood cells carrying oxygen molecules. And we see this weird word hemoglobin. But before we get too far, let's remember, what was this oxygen required for? What process? Yeah, we're talking about cellular respiration, right? Oxygen has to travel through your blood to get to cells that need energy. And so there's this important molecule, hemoglobin, which is actually a protein. It looks like this. Now, can you find any of these levels of protein structure in this hemoglobin protein macromolecule? Well, we've got a ton of amino acids joined together, so that's our primary structure. You can see these spirals, which are the alpha helices we saw for secondary structure. And we've actually got 4 different 3D subunits joined together here, So this is a really complex protein, and it's an important protein because it's the thing that attracts oxygen to the red blood cells. And it does that because there's this really strong affinity or love between oxygen and iron. And heme just means iron. So we've got like a chemical attraction here. Now, I want to zoom out for you guys and think about the big idea in all of this stuff we're learning about macromolecules. The key thing here is that structures influence functions. So each macromolecule has a very specific structure that determines how it does its job. Now, that might be for carbohydrates that we have simple sugars for quick energy. You know what happens when you eat all the Halloween candy. Or we join a lot of those together and we have complex carbohydrates, which athletes might use to carb load when they're preparing for an endurance event, or which plant mites use for structure or for storage. We also have fats, and they can have these interesting chemical properties that we saw in phospholipids that allow them to form really complex membranes around our cells. They can also store a lot more energy than carbohydrates because they have more bonds in each triglyceride. And then remember, for proteins, we've got a really complex shape here, and that allows these proteins to bind to different molecules and have those really diverse functions that we saw in enzymes, in transport, in hormones, and all kinds of other things. So if you can keep structure to function in mind, you're all set for macromolecules.